Hello, beautiful community. You're very welcome to this brief chat about something really interesting we should watch out for in an informational environment that some, not most, some members of the Russian opposition in the West are at risk of doing. And it is half an innocent thing to do and half a misdemeanor, but what do we make sure we don't do on this channel is unnecessarily paint ourselves as victims. It's also something that we, a Western audience, often encourages in the Russian opposition. And it's not entirely healthy. So let's talk about it. What we've basically got going on is a situation where some oppositional Russian voices are at risk of presenting themselves to us as though speaking to us is their B job, with their A job being speaking to Russians. But in fact, it's become the case that speaking to us is their A job and their B job and their C job, and speaking to Russians has got somewhere lost along the way. And the problem isn't that they're speaking to us and not speaking to Russians. The problem is that they're speaking to us as though their main job was still speaking to Russians, but it isn't. And that is something that we're going to explore today via a brief thread I've written for us. Let's do it. And it's Easter time, so we'll really be under 10 minutes, I promise, in this episode. Oppositional Russians in the West sometimes get into a co-conspiracy with Western audiences. They stop regarding Russia as their country, but pretend they haven't. To a Western audience, this comes off as decent and principled. I mean, look at them, they're being really tough on Russia, defeat the Putin thing, defeat the imperialism thing. I mean, it sounds very strong, very principled, very nice. So it comes off as decent and principled, but in reality, it's depoliticized theater. Imagine, and we're not naming names today because it's Easter time, Arseny, a fictional Russian opposition voice in the West, who gives a speech. And he begins the speech by saying, we must take Crimea, we must make Crimea Ukrainian again, and defeat Russia's imperialist mindset. Now, analytically, let's just assume that the bare bones of this position are sound, that Ukraine regaining Crimea, with many qualifications we might add, but Ukraine regaining Crimea is good for Russia too. Just assume that for the purpose of this chat. But here a question arises. For whom is Arseny speaking when he says, we must make Crimea Ukrainian again and defeat Russia's imperialist mindset? And here we run into a problem. It is, to put it mildly, not obvious that Arseny is speaking as though Russia was still his country. The content of what Arseny says is contradicted by the spirit or by the form of how he says it. The content tells us we Russians need Ukraine to win. But the form, the spirit, pulls the rug from beneath the content, betraying a detached position which no longer speaks for Russians. So the content is saying, we Russians need this, but the form says, let's go get these Russians. Is Russia your country? Is it not? Is Russia your country? Is it not? To come out of this self-indulgent position, Arseny has two options. He can change the form to match the content, or he can change the content to match the form. The former, changing the form to match the content, would mean Arseny taking ownership as a Russian. We Russians need a Ukrainian victory. The latter, changing the content to match the form, would mean Arseny being honest about his psychic immigration. I want a Ukrainian victory, but I no longer see Russia as my country. Unfortunately, Arseny is rewarded for staying stuck in this quagmire it gets him a round of applause from a Western audience. And here I want to say that while there is a co-conspiracy and we are complicit in this, well, not me, because I have too much of a view of this sideways because I follow this stuff, but I think a lot of well-meaning Western citizens who support Ukraine can fairly understandably fall for this. I mean, they're presented with somebody who seems to be spirited and principled, and how do they know if that person is speaking for Russians or not? So they can fall for this idea that they're being presented with somebody who is, leading Russians in some direction, whereas in fact, they're looking at somebody who is surfing Western audience preferences. And so Arseny is rewarded for this, and that's tricky. However, Arseny's position isn't serious. I've got to be real about that. It's a depoliticized evasion of political responsibility, and we know where we're going next, because it's the same thing that we observe in an extreme form inside Russia. The same thing that Arseny himself rails against. We in the West should try, whenever possible, to not applaud those Russian opposition voices that end up in this quagmire. We should try to not applaud them too glibly, because in great part they end up in this quagmire because of our applause. Now we're going to name some names. No, we're not going to name names because it's Easter time, and also the lesson in a kind of reflection like this is wider. Right? It's a wider lesson of depoliticization, a wider lesson of effective versus expressive communication. And I hope that it's been of some value to us. Let me just say that I know some of you are going to be listening to music at Easter time, and I wanted to say that if you're going to listen to any Bach, or if you're going to listen to St. Matthew's Passion, the recording I would recommend this Easter would be the 1962 Klemperer recording of the Matthew Passion, because while it in some ways fails to pass the test of freshness for our contemporary musical imagination, it is in other ways remarkable and contains so many extraordinary musicians. The singers include Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, who is perhaps second to Maria Callas in that period up until 1954, when she became histrionic, the greatest singer of the 20th century. And it also has Elisabeth Schwarzkopf and Christa Ludwig. I'm going to link this up below in case you're going to be listening to Bach around Easter. I know that 2.4% of you will be. Lots of love, and talk soon.